Welcome to the Lawrence County Museum and to one of our lectures on the Revolutionary War, starring Durrant Ashmore. Yay! So, just before we get started, understand if we have microphone difficulties, it's not our microphones, it's him. We have already decided that. We don't know why, but there's something about him. So, as always, we welcome our members and our guests, and if you're not a member, please consider joining. So a few things are coming up. You know, we try to keep things fresh here. We don't like things to be stale. We don't want people to say, oh yeah, I visited the museum last year, and that's it. Nope, got to come back. I also want to recognize our volunteers. We are mostly a volunteer organization. We do have a few, like 2, part-time employees. Connie Post, of course, is one, and Chris Pennington is the other. And they, thank goodness, stick with us through thick and thin, but our volunteers do too. So if you are a volunteer in any way of this museum, please stand. Thank you so much. We do appreciate what they do for us. We really could not do what we do without them. So, moving ahead, it's a brand new year. It's a brand new year for you and for the museum. Lots of things are coming up. There are a couple of events that I wanted to mention, and of course I'm not going to give you details. You can look on our website and on our Facebook page, and if you can't find it, call somebody. Call one of our volunteers or call the office, and we'll try to point you in the right direction. February 8th, Gathering of Quilters. I think this is going to be a fun event for people who like to quilt and people who just like to look at quilts also. February the 11th, the role of the enslaved and free blacks in the American Revolution by none other than Durant. So you get to hear him again on February the 11th. On February the 13th, the Lawrence District Genealogy Society meeting is at 7 o'clock that night. It's open to the public. You don't have to be a member. And I don't know what they're talking about that night. Does anybody know?
They're doing the history of the Genealogy Society, and they're asking people to bring special things in they would like to share. They've asked people to bring special things in that they found during genealogy research or anything, a special picture or a special story. But also you'll hear about the Genealogy Society history too.
Thank you. February the 15th is the opening of our exhibit, The Road to Education for Black Americans. We will have Dr. Lily Beasley Glover, who was a 1957 graduate of Sanders and a professor emeritus at South Carolina State University. That lecture will be at 11. The opening would begin then, too. February the 18th, Romancing the Gullah, a lecture with Dr. Kendra Hamilton, who is an English professor at the Presbyterian College. She will share the history of the Gullah people of South Carolina. That lecture is at 7. March 6th, Women in the American Revolution with, once again, Durant. He is such a diva. I like to tease him. So, and March the 15th, there's going to be a tour of the Piney Grove School, which was an African-American schoolhouse at the Culbertson Backcountry Settlement in Gray Court at 1 p.m. So if you're interested in any of that, contact us or check our website and the Facebook page. Thank you, and ta-da!
I don't get no respect. I'm the Rodney Dangerfield of the Lawrence County Museum. Anyway, tonight we are talking about one of the most important figures in the American Revolution, particularly here in South Carolina, and that is Thomas Sumter. Thomas Sumter was one of the three triumvirate of supreme militia leaders in the United States, and those are Marion, Pickens, and Sumter. The three best militia generals are from South Carolina, and one of that triumvirate is Thomas Sumter. Thomas Sumter came from a modest background in Virginia. His father was a miller. He participated in the French and Indian War. Thomas Sumter had a long life. He lived to the age of 98. He was the last American general to die in the American Revolution. Now, Lafayette died 3 or 4 years afterwards, and he was an American general, but anyway, Thomas Sumter lived to the age of 98. And his exploits in the French and Indian War are just as interesting as anything else he ever did in life. He was a young, strapping, athletic man, and he was a British provincial during that French and Indian War. That means he wore the uniform of the British Army. He was wearing red. He was recognized as a leader. There weren't too many battles in the French and Indian War, and I'm not sure of the battles that he fought in. But after that war was over and the treaty was signed with the Cherokees, he was given the task of traveling to Cherokee territory and delivering that treaty to the Cherokee leading men. And his partner in this endeavor, Henry Timberlake. And Thomas Sumter and Henry Timberlake traveled 600 miles by canoe. It was a harrowing journey, took 3 times longer than it was supposed to, bitter cold. Finally, they made it to the Cherokee overhill town capital of Chota. And this is a map of that journey right here that was drawn by Henry Timberlake. And this map was 100% accurate, and it really helped open up an understanding with the overhill Cherokees and the European settlers as well. So when Sumter and Timberlake got up to Chota, and they had this treaty that the Cherokees couldn't read, but they made their mark. And leading men of the Cherokees wanted to come back to Williamsburg and meet with the governor. And Sumter and Timberlake said, well, sure, fine, let's come on back. And so they all came back, and they went to Williamsburg, and they met with the governor there. And the governor was saying, oh, great, I'm so happy we've got a treaty now. We're going to live, in peace, and they did for 15 years. And one of the leading men said, we need to go to London. Why don't you take us to London? Because 7 Cherokee chiefs had gone to London in 1730, and they were the talk of the town, the toast of the town. And that was 30 years earlier, and it still was generating excitement. So these 3 leading men planned to go to London. The Sumter's in there, the governor's in there, Henry Timberlake's in there, and Sumter says, that's great, I'll give you my receipts on the way back. It's really a question if that conversation was ever had or not. But anyway, Sumter and Timberlake and a third man who was the interpreter, they all get on the ship with the 3 Cherokee leading men, and they sail to London. And it's not quite the same as it was the first time. It wasn't a huge success, even though they did have some meetings and so forth. And then they turned around. Well, I didn't tell you this part. On the way over, the third man, who was the interpreter, he died at sea. So that left Sumter as being the interpreter, and he only knew 15 Cherokee words. So that's one reason that the trip to London didn't do so well. But coming back, on the way back, they came into Charleston. And then Sumter escorted the leading men through the state of South Carolina, and he got a real good look at the beauty of South Carolina. They came up the Cherokee Path, and they went up into the Overhill towns, which are in Tennessee, and that's where those leading men were from. And when Sumter got there, there was a Frenchman in the Cherokee camp. Now, they had just finished a war with the French over kicking the French out of North America, which they did legally. But this Frenchman now is in the Cherokee camp, and he's really there as a spy. And Sumter says to the Cherokees, hey, he ain't supposed to be here. You need to arrest that man. And the Cherokees said, we don't care if he's here or not. You arrest him. So Sumter did, and they had a knockdown, drag-out fight, and Sumter won. And he tied the guy up, and he threw him on his horse. And then he jumped on the horse, and they rode for 200 miles down into Charleston, doubled up like that all the way. So that fellow was thrown in jail in Charleston. But then Sumter made it back to Virginia, and he goes to the governor, and he says, here's my receipts. And the governor says, what are you talking about? And he refused to honor or pay those receipts. And the creditors of Sumter and Timberlake did not take very kindly to that. And Thomas Sumter wound up being thrown into debtor's prison in Staunton, Virginia. So he wasn't there very long before one of his friends paid off a guard, and Sumter escaped. And he came to South Carolina. Thomas Sumter came to South Carolina, fought in the American Revolution in South Carolina as an escaped fugitive. He was. Later, he did have an occurrence to go back to Virginia. This is after the war, or after the war. And he was arrested. But one of his friends paid the debt immediately, and that was the end of that. So here is probably the culmination of the trip to London. It shows the three chiefs or leading men, and I'm not sure exactly what that attire is, or those headdresses or anything else, but they took a lot of liberties in the portraiture back then. So Thomas Sumter, when he came back and the Revolutionary War was starting up, he joined the Camden militia. And because he had experience fighting as a British provincial, he was elected an officer. And his militia group was pulled in. They kind of had a draft. And his group was pulled into the Continental line. So now he was a Continental soldier and Continental officer, and he was given the rank of colonel in the 2nd South Carolina Continental line. And after the Snow Campaign here in the backcountry, after the Cherokee War of 1776, and Thomas Sumter did not have a big role in those campaigns. But he stayed as the colonel. After the Cherokee War of 1776, there was a relative period of calm in South Carolina for 2.5 years. It was all this fighting in the north. That's where the war was going on. There's no doubt about that. But it was relatively quiet down in South Carolina. It was so quiet that Thomas Sumter got bored, and he resigned his commission about mid-1778, and he went back home to his wife. Now, after he left from Virginia, he did marry, I think her name was Mary, And she was a little older than him, and she was a widow, and she was an invalid, and she was wealthy. But by all accounts, Thomas Sumter and Mary, it was definitely a marriage of love. So he even risked his men's life at one particular point to go behind enemy lines to take her and their one son named Thomas Jr. to take them to safety. So that was a loving marriage, even though she was a wealthy widow. Thomas Sumter was not a gold digger, but he was a good businessman. And he had a store on the Santee close to Nelson's Ferry. That's where all the traffic from Charleston to Camden went. You had to go by Sumter's store, so it was a profitable business for him, and he was a good businessman. So Charleston fell on May the 12th, 1780. Thomas Sumter is a storekeeper. When Charleston fell, the British authorities said, "Come in, sign your parole that you will lay down your arms and we'll leave you alone." Well, Thomas Sumter never laid down his arms. So, the British kind of had it in for him. So, this sketch right here shows the area around where Thomas Sumter was operating. And right here, this is Camden. This is the Great Wagon Road. And this is the way that Bannister Tarleton went as he was chasing after Abraham Buford when he caught him up here on May the 29th, 1780, at the Battle of the Waxhaws. On the way up to the Waxhaws, a contingent of the British Legion, which is Bannister Tarleton's group, under Charles Campbell, they came and they gave Thomas Sumter's home a visit because he had not signed his parole. Now, he had 1 hour's notice that the British were coming after him, and he quickly went home. He put on his uniform, his blue Continental uniform, and kissed his wife goodbye and dashed out of the house and got away. And as soon as he got away, the British Legion comes to his plantation looking for him. If he had stayed there, they would have left him alone, made him sign parole, but he wasn't there. So they picked up his wife, who was in her chair, picked her up because she's an invalid, carried her out into the middle of the front yard and sat her down. Then they proceeded to burn all the outbuildings, barns, kitchens, slave quarters. They burned all of that. Apparently they left the house standing, but they stripped it clean of everything that was there. So that happened the day before the Battle of the Waxhaws. What this is a map of is what happened during the summer of 1780. May the 29th is when the Waxhaws occurred. The word was out that was a brutal slaughter of men being killed after the white flag was raised. A week later, Richard Wynne at Alexander's Old Fields attacks a group of loyalists who were there meeting. 32 men, and there were 200 loyalists, but the loyalists were not expecting an attack. And apparently this was just kind of a warning because there were no injuries during the incident at Alexander's Old Fields. But 4 days later at Mobley's Meeting House, where 200 loyalists had gathered who had been plundering Patriot homesteads, and they had their booty there. And John McClure and about 35 men attacked that place, ran several hundred Tories off, and captured all of that booty and redistributed it. When Richard Wynne attacked at Alexander's oil field, the British authorities were so upset over that they completely burned his plantation to the ground that was in Winnsboro. And when Richard Wynn was told about what happened, he said, "I expected as much." So this is the beginnings of the pushback to British takeover of South Carolina. And believe me, they had taken over South Carolina. There were several leading men, leading militiamen in this area: William Hill, Edward Lacey, Richard Wynn, Tom Taylor, William Bratton. These were top-notch colonels, and they were Sumter's colonels throughout the war. Well, they all met together with Thomas Sumter at Tuskegee Ford on the Catawba River in North Carolina, and they decided that Thomas Sumter should lead them in battle. They, in effect, had elected or nominated or appointed him general. And everybody regarded him as general, but it was not official, and that became an issue a little bit later on. But when he was nominated general, he then went up to Hillsborough, North Carolina, where the governor in exile was, John Rutledge. And they discussed what they were going to do, how they were going to carry on the war with South Carolina being 95% under British control. So at this time, John Rutledge gave Thomas Sumter 17 certificates worth £1,000 each, and that's over $5 million in today's money. And he was given instructions to equip his militia with that money, and that's what he did. And that's one reason he wasn't around during these incidents with Alexander's oil mill and Hill's Iron Works being burned down. July the 12th, Huck's defeat, a major victory with William Bratton and the militia defeating Philadelphia provincials. So, Thomas Sumter was with the governor during these times. But when he came back, he established a camp in the Catawba Indian Reservation. This was his base of operations for the longest time, in particular in this area. And he brought in hundreds of men, very loyal. Thomas Sumter's men were very loyal to him, and that speaks highly of him. I don't always have a lot of good things to say about Thomas Sumter, and you'll be hearing that. But the loyalty of his men is a huge plus for Thomas Sumter's esteem, in my opinion. So the first battle that Thomas Sumter entered into once he came back from North Carolina was at Rocky Mount. Now let me show you where Rocky Mount is, if I can get it. Rocky Mount is right here, and there's a ford over the Catawba here, and Rocky Mount controls the Catawba River in this area. There was a sister fort to Rocky Mount, Hanging Rock. Hanging Rock controlled the Great Wagon Road. So these two forts, which were sister forts, controlled communication and travel between these areas. This all leads up to Charlotte, to Salisbury, to Hillsborough. So, take note of where these are. Also, take note of where Carey's Fort is. This is just southwest of Camden, and it guarded a ford over the Catawba at this area. So, when Sumter came back, he did attack Rocky Mount. And this was guarding the ford over the Catawba River right here. This was a cleared field for 200 yards all the way around. Rocky Mount sat on an eminence. It was a framed house. It was built out of saw-cut lumber. There was only one house that was saw-cut lumber in the 96th District during the Revolutionary War, and that's Walnut Grove Plantation. Everything else was log cabins. So if you had a frame house, you had the finest house in the land. This was a big two-story frame house. Now, it did have 2 log cabin structures close by. These are rocks, hence the name Rocky Mount. And in particular, there's a big rock right here. So, and this, 50 yards out, is abattis that the British had made. Abattis is little saplings that are laid down in the ground with the tips of the limbs pointing outwards. And then you take a machete and you just, whack them at an angle, and now you've got a very sharpened tip right there that a man's not going to walk through or run through, or a horse is not going to plow through. It's 18th century barbed wire. Abattis, it's a French word, A-B-A-T-I-S. So Sumter, he had 500 men. There were 300 men defending Rocky Mount. Sumter attacked 3 times, but as soon as they got to the abattis, they just could not get through it, and they were just suffering unnecessary casualties that way. So closer towards the end of the day, and this was a long fight, Sumter was looking at the terrain, and he says, dang, if we could get behind this rock right here, we may be able to do some damage. But the only thing was, to get to that rock, you had to run 100 yards over open ground. And Thomas Sumter looked at his men, and he says, fellas, is anybody that will run over that ground right there and maybe get close enough to where we can throw some flaming ingots on top of the frame house? And one man stood up, and this was William Hill. This was Colonel William Hill, one of his trusted, loyal colonels, who could have told any of his men, you go. But no, he went himself. But he did ask for a volunteer, and Sergeant Jimmy Johnson volunteered as well. So what those men did was, this is the only time that I know of armor, body armor, in the Revolutionary War. These men strapped fat lighter all the way around their bodies, covered their bodies with pine, pitch tar, rich pine knots, and so forth. And they ran all the way across this field and got behind the rock and started to build a fire. But at that time, Turnbull, who was the commander, he ordered a bayonet charge. And they charged out of the house, and with bayonets, they ran off William Hill and Jimmy Johnson. And they had to go all the way back. And they talked to Thomas Sumter, and he said, dang, I didn't think of that. So he said, why don't y'all try it again, and we'll set up riflemen here so that they can't come out with a bayonet charge. And they did it. So those men strapped that fat lighter on their body again and made that 100-yard dash all over again while they're being shot at. They had balls going through their clothes. They had locks of their hair cut off. It's one of the most heroic acts that I can imagine in the American Revolution, running that gauntlet. And they got behind the shelter rock, and they built a fire. And they took the fat lighter, and they caught that on fire, and they started throwing it, and it landed on one of those little log cabin buildings that was close to the frame house. And the siding on the frame house was so hot, the siding started smoking. When at that instant, a thunderstorm came up. A massive thunderstorm. and it totally drenched the fire that they had going. And Sumter had to call off, and he had to retreat. And that was a lost battle for Thomas Sumter. The first battle that he fought in was a defeat. But while that was going on at Rocky Mount, Thomas Sumter did launch a diversionary attack on Rocky Mount, which is about 15 miles away. Now, again, this is a sister fort. So what he did was William Richardson Davie from North Carolina, very influential militiaman, future governor of North Carolina, the founder of the University of North Carolina, with 80 men, William Richardson Davie, militiamen, dressed, farm boy clothes. He's got 40 mounted riflemen and 40 dragoons, which are probably armed with swords, even though it's not defined here. So he's going into a camp of North Carolina militiamen under Samuel Bryan, and there's about 500 men here. And they are farm boys dressed in their everyday clothes, just like Davie and his farm boys dressed the same way. William Richardson Davie goes right into the middle of the camp, goes up the corral, ties their horses. This is with 40 of his men. Now, the other 40, he had them go around to the lane, is what the reports say. They were at the end of the lane. William Richardson Davie ties his horses up. His men have their rifles. They're loaded. They turn around, and they fire immediately upon Bryan's North Carolina militiamen. And they do significant damage. And the survivors of that run down to the end of the lane. And that's where the 40 dragoons are. And they have do significant damage. Now, there's no reports of the numbers of Bryan's North Carolina loyalist militiamen who were killed, but there were a lot of them. So when Davie does that, he did this hit and run within 30 minutes. The British Legion was camped right here. Now, this was a half a mile away. The British Legion saw all of this, but they were just far enough away to where Davie could get away. There were 3 camps at Hanging Rock. Hanging Rock. The North Carolina militia, the British Legion right here, and then other provincials, the Prince of Wales Regiment, and some elements of the 63rd and the 71st Regiments of Foot. So Davie goes back to Sumter and says, hey, I know the layout of that camp now, and I believe we can do some more damage there. So 6 days later, on August the 6th, they returned. And this time, Sumter has all his men, and he's got at least 500 or 600. And they attack first. They go right through Bryan's militia again. They were obviously pretty sorry soldiers. And as they do that, this camp just flees. Now, Hill and Lacey, Sumter, South Carolina men, and Richard Irwin from North Carolina, and he's got hundreds of men, they start attacking the British Legion. And they're making good headway overrunning this camp. This was the central camp. This was the main fortification. So when John Carden, the colonel of the Prince of Wales Regiment, saw that, he's back here. And John Carden is overall commandant of all of these. So he takes his Prince of Wales Regiment. One report says 175 men, the other says 500 men. But anyway, he takes them and he comes around on a flanking maneuver. And now these militiamen are in a crossfire. and from the fort and from the Prince of Wales Regiment. So this was where Sumter had most of his casualties. There were a total of 20 killed and 40 wounded. But when the Prince of Wales Regiment comes on the field, Sumter's reserves under William Richardson Davie and Richard Wynn, two of the most battle-hardened colonels that the Southern militia had. And they were in reserve. And they were in reserve down here, and now they come onto the field, and now the Prince of Wales Regiment is in a crossfire coming through. And the Prince of Wales Regiment was absolutely decimated. Of those numbers I gave you, of the numbers that went into the battle, there were only 9 that came out. It was the end of the Prince of Wales Volunteers of America Regiment. Those other 9 just got absorbed into other units. The Prince of Wales Regiment was so torn up that their commander, John Carden, resigned in the middle of the battle. And he turned over command to John Rousselet of the British Legion. And John Rousselet gathered the scattered survivors of all this carnage that had gone on. And this battle lasted 4 or 5 hours. And he pulled his men together, and they formed a square. And to defend the square, they had cannons on opposite corners. So you couldn't attack from anywhere without running into the grape shot of those cannons. And nobody really wanted to do that. So it kind of became a standoff. This is the only time in the American Revolution that a square was formed, right here at Hanging Rock in just north of Camden in South Carolina. So one thing about what the Patriots and Sumter and his men had done, when he went into this battle, 200 of his men did not have arms, muskets or rifles, but they picked them up off the battlefield. Many of his men only had 2 balls, some had 5 balls apiece to shoot out of their rifles. But when they overran the British camp, they had everything they needed. They had shot, they had powder, they had rum. And they got so much rum that they got unmanageable. They didn't snatch defeat, but they totally became unmanageable as soldiers. And Sumter had to call the fight off. But of course, you know, this defensive square was so tight anyway, they may not have made any progress. So when the soldiers in the square see Sumter's men start to leave, they're starting to feel a little chippy. And they start up with 3 cheers for King George, hip hip hooray, hip hip hooray. Well, those Patriots weren't going to have any of that, and they were drunk anyway. 3 cheers for George Washington, huzzah, huzzah, huzzah. It was like a high school football game as they were coming and going. But they left, and that was Sumter's second battle, and it was huge. He did really good in that battle. So now, that was on August the 6th. By August the 16th, Horatio Gates is coming down from the north. George Washington sent him down with a Continental Army to save South Carolina because we had lost so bad at Charleston. Gates is the hero of Saratoga. So he's coming down, and as he does, you know, Sumter knows he's coming down. Sumter goes to has a meeting with Horatio Gates, and he tells Gates that he thinks it would just be a wonderful idea if he attacked the British supply lines, excuse me, which is down here at Carey's Fort. And Sumter said, we'll cripple the British if we take their supplies. They won't be able to carry on the fight. And Gates says, okay, we'll go ahead and take that fort. And by the way, if you need the help, he's 300 men from the 3rd Maryland Regiment, who he sent down to screen for Sumter down here. So August the 15th, Sumter sends Edward Lacey and Tom Taylor and about 35 men of their country homeboys riding to scout out Carey's Fort. And when we get there, there's 35 loyalist militiamen dressed the same way, and they were expecting company. Well, they got company, but not what they were expecting, because it was Lacey and Taylor, and they were all dressed, mistaken identity again, and so they were captured. The loyalists were captured. And then Sumter came in with all his other men. And as they were there guarding the fort, here comes 70 men of the 71st Regiment of Foot coming from 96, and they were bringing extra supplies. And Sumter had captured all of these supplies, and he had a total of 50 loaded wagons with flour and tents and ammunition, all the things that an army needed. He had 300 head of cattle. He had 100 prisoners, and he had a herd of sheep. You can't ask for better than that. But anyway, that was the day before the Battle of Camden, which is one of the absolute worst defeats in South Carolina history. This was a disaster. It was the worst battle that just about in the American Revolution. So Gates's army was just wiped out. And that meant that Thomas Sumter was now the only organized body in the state of resistance. And so Cornwallis, was going after him. And Sumter started escaping all the way through, in 36 hours, pushing on through, till he gets up here on the other side of Fishing Creek, between Fishing Creek and Catawba. And he feels like that's kind of safe because, nobody can cross the Catawba, and we can defend Fishing Creek, so I'll be all right there. He gets there in the middle of the day on August the 18th, and it is hot, hot, hot. And Sumter is worn out, his men are worn out, so they stop and they start swimming in the river, bathing, slaughtering cattle, having barbecues, drinking rum. They were just totally relaxing. So here is Sumter's camp in between Fishing Creek and the Catawba River. And he knew that there were two groups coming after him, Turnbull and Ferguson. And he had eyes on these guys. And they were at least 10 miles away. And Thomas Sumter had taken a break. He had, stripped down, and he was sleeping underneath a wagon because they all needed rest. But what Sumter didn't know, that there's a third party after him, and this is Bannister Tarleton. And Bannister Tarleton's coming up the east side of the Catawba River. When he comes up and he goes over and he looks down, now Sumter, 700 men, 100 prisoners, 300 cattle, 50 wagons. Sumter gets on an eminence overlooking, and he's got 170 of his British Legion cavalry armed with sabers. and he sees Sumter's camp totally sprawled out before him. And Tarleton does what Tarleton does. He charged. And he charged through that camp with those sabers swinging, and there were 300 of his 700 men, 350 were killed, captured, or wounded. He freed the 100 prisoners. He ate the steaks that they were cooking. I mean, it was just a complete disaster for Sumter. Sumter cut loose a horse, one of the draft horses, and bareback, bare saddle, no bridle. He jumps on that horse and rides away. And he's riding away, he turns behind him, he looks, see who was chasing him, and he runs right into a limb of an oak tree and gets knocked off his horse, knocked silly. One of his men did come up and pull him into the brush where he wasn't seen, and Thomas Sumter got away. But Fishing Creek was an absolute disaster. This is the lowest point in South Carolina Revolutionary War history. 2 days after Cowpens, with that horrible battle, now we have another horrible battle right here at Fishing Creek. Also on that same day, however, there was another battle here in Lawrence County. And in that battle, there were 200 Loyalists that were stationed, camped at Musgrove Mill on the Enoree River. And from Charles McDowell's camp in the North and South Carolina border near Spartanburg, there were Elijah Clark from Georgia, Isaac Shelby from the Tennessee, the Over Mountain men, and James Williams from right here in Lawrence County. The 200 men that left from McDowell's camp to attack the 200 Loyalists rode 40 miles overnight. When they got to Musgrove Mill in the morning, they learned that a party of 300 men, provincials under Alexander Ennis, had arrived at Musgrove Mill. So now there's 500 Loyalist forces against the 200 worn out men. They set up a breastworks because they were too tired to retreat. They lured the British into charging into that breastworks. And that was an absolute victory for the Patriot cause. 200 men totally defeating 500 Loyalists, significant loss for the Loyalist side. And that was a ray of hope for the Patriot fortunes. From Musgrove Mill on, we talk about turning points in the war. Saratoga was a turning point. Saratoga is the main turning point. But when you're looking at the war in the South, the most significant turning point is Musgrove Mill. There was not a single significant setback after Musgrove Mill. So he may ask you when the turning point was, you tell him, Musgrove Mill. And it was. So Thomas Sumter fought in 10 battles in South Carolina. He won 5, he lost 5. Rocky Creek, Hanging Rock, Carey's Fort, Fishing Creek. After Fishing Creek, Thomas Sumter did retreat into the Catawba Indian Reservation, and as bad as that loss was, men still flocked to him. And he continued his goings about, he was encamped around the Fish Dam Ford on the Broad River. James Weems was sent to attack him, but Weems was not a good battlefield commander. Anyway, Sumter won at Fishing Creek November the 9th of 1780. Cornwallis, who was down in Winsboro now, and Sumter and Catawba Reservation, they were a little bit too close for comfort to each other, and they were raiding the same mills, and Cornwallis was getting fed up with Sumter, so he withdraws Francis Marion from being chased by Banastre Tarleton. He tells Tarleton, said, leave Marion alone, I need you to go deal with Sumter. And that's when Francis Marion says, the devil himself couldn't catch that damned old fox. And Banastre Tarleton gave Francis Marion the nickname of the Swamp Fox. So anyway, Tarleton starts chasing after Sumter till he comes to Blackstock's, and that was a perfect setup. And Sumter now has 1,000 men, and this is the battlefield at Blackstock's. So this is the home of Mr. Blackstock's. It was a two-story log cabin. It's set on the highest point of the battlefield. It controlled activity down through here. One distinctive feature that Blackstock's farm had was he had very heavy fencing all the way around, so tall that deer couldn't jump over it. I thought at first it was a corral to keep horses in. No, it was so big it kept deer out, whole logs and everything. Well, Banastre Tarleton, he tried his same trick that he tried time after time, charge full speed ahead. As the battle progressed, he finally had his British Legion charge right up through here with heavy logs on each side, creating an absolute funnel. The first horse gets shot and falls down. Now you have a bottleneck. Then the last horse gets shot. You can't go out that way. 91 men lost their life right here in this Blackstock's Road in Spartanburg County. No, actually, Union County, sorry. Of 270 men, he had 92 killed, over 100 wounded, and the rest got away. But one thing that did happen at Blackstock's, there were just a few killed, like four casualties only. But one of those casualties, one of those wounded, was Thomas Sumter. Because at the end of the battle, and this is where Sumter watched the battle from, he started going down to see just where the British were, how far they were away. And he got too close to their retreating lines. And somebody loaded up a brown bass musket with a buckshot, and they shot him and got him in the right shoulder with 5 shotgun pellets. And it was a significant wound, and Sumter was out of the battle, out of the war, for the next 4 or 5 months. When he comes back, he has a series called Sumter's Rounds. This was very mixed results. He's attacking forts. He wanted to attack Fort Granby because there was so much plunder there, but he was unsuccessful. He was successful at Orangeburg, but basically, well, his round ended when he tried to attack Fort Watson. And this is one place where his poor battlefield tactics came to the fore, and he had way more casualties than he should have when he attacked Fort Watson. And that was in March of 1781, which is planting season. So after Fort Watson, Sumter brought all his men back and said, look, you guys, go plant your crops. We'll get together later and we'll talk about how we're going to continue to fight here. So he basically dismissed his men. And then I went up to talk to the governor again. They were close and should have been, because, you know, the governor directed what happened with the militia. And Sumter proposes to the governor to establish South Carolina provincials that were signed up on a regular basis, state troops. These were state troops with 10-month sign-up period. And the way that he was going to pay these troops was through plundering Loyalist plantations and dividing the plunder with his men. And the primary way that he was going to be funding this operation was through what is referred to as Sumter's Law. For every private who signed up for 10 months, you would get one slave plundered from a Loyalist home. If you were a sergeant, you would get 1.5 slaves. If you were a captain, you'd get 2.5 slaves. A half slave was defined as a slave under the age of 10 or over the age of 45. And, I mean, slaves were plunder back then. Slaves is how men were paid. Continental soldiers. If you signed up for the Continental Line in South Carolina for 1 year, you were given 100 acres in the former Cherokee territory, which is Greenville, Spartanburg, Anderson, and Pickens and Oconee, not Spartanburg, but Pickens and Oconee counties. You were given 100 acres for every year you signed up for. 3 years, 300 acres, plus a slave for every 100 acres. So South Carolina Continental soldiers were paid in slaves, as were Sumter's men. And this is, and I'm going to be talking about this when we talk in Black History Month. But the Revolutionary War in South Carolina could not have been a worse time to be a slave. Now, it was horrible all the time. It was extra horrible in the Revolutionary War because you never knew when you were going to be snatched up and sent to somebody else. You had no idea what it was like, leaving your family behind, never to be seen again. So it was pretty darn bad for the slave population. And Sumter's Law is one thing that contributed to that greatly. And Sumter got pushback because it was bad for the morale of the slave population. You know, there were certain ethics that should be followed, and keeping families together was an ethic, even though there was always that constant fear that family members or yourself would be shipped away, never to be seen again. So that's a preview of next month's lecture. Sumter's battles, so that shows his 10 battles. And that's my last slide right there. Sumter, I'm going to tell you one other, well, I'm going to tell you several thoughts I have about Sumter. And one of them is, if there's any one individual that may have made the difference in whether we won or lost, you could easily make a case for Thomas Sumter. Nobody else is getting 1,000 men in the field. Francis Marion had just a few hundred. You know, the loyalty of his colonels is another factor. But one of the biggest criticism about Sumter, particularly militarily, is what a stinker he was when it came to cooperating with anybody, and especially the Continental Army, especially Nathaniel Greene, the most important general that we've got in the South. Sumter's not cooperating with him. And after Sumter was wounded at Blackstocks, and Daniel Morgan and Andrew Pickens were now leading Sumter's men, Sumter pitched a snit about Morgan giving orders to his men while Morgan is in the camp with Sumter's men. Thomas Sumter's plan was to give an order to his men. Daniel Morgan had to send a message to North Carolina where Sumter was recuperating, and then Sumter would send a message back to his men who are right there on the same battlefield with Daniel Morgan. That was his plan. And Nathaniel Greene did get involved, and he kind of got that straightened out. But he did not cooperate with Greene throughout the war. The siege of 96 may have been successful if Sumter had bothered down Rawdon as he was coming from Charleston. So that's my spiel on Thomas Sumter. Sounds like this microphone's about to die anyway. Somebody's telling me something. It's like that big thunderstorm that came while they were trying to put that fire out. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, and I'll repeat your question so the audience can hear. How did he get the name of the Gamecock? Well, he was on and I believe in North Carolina, and he was with some brothers who were fighting gamecocks. And they said that Thomas Sumter reminded blue hen gamecock. So that's how we got it, and it stuck. Yes. He was in government after the war, and he was a successful plantation owner. I'm sure he managed his store as well. He was in the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. You know, I frequently say that these men were fighting for self-determination. Marion, Pickens, and Sumter all went into government after the war. They all were making the laws. They were determining for themselves how we would be living from here on out. Yes. Who maintains Sumter in Stateburg? And I'm sorry, I don't know. I'm sure somebody dedicated local person. Yeah, it's a nice grave. It sure is. Well, I think this bad microphone's about to die. Has nothing to do with me. Yes. Okay, you certainly may. We'll see how it does for you.
No, hearing what he said about the Frenchman that Sumter took care of that wasn't supposed to be there among the Cherokee, it is interesting to know that that one son that Thomas Sumter had later became the U.S. ambassador to France after the collapse of the French government. And also, he married Thomas Sumter's son married a French loyalist young lady that escaped the beheading of the French loyalist and was educated with Theodosia Burr Alston in the home of Aaron Burr. And of course, Theodosia Burr, Aaron Burr's daughter, married who later became the governor of South Carolina. So she was Theodosia Burr Alston, and she's the one that sailed from Brook Green Gardens, heading to see her father after he had come back from being in Europe after he had done all that he had done, and has never been seen again. But it was Theodosia Burr Alston's good friend that she was raised together in her home in New York that married Thomas Sumter Jr. and went to France, which France was her home.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you very much. That was a nice little bit of history there. So, no more questions, I guess that's it. Thank you. Did you notice that the microphone worked perfect with the...